Okay, let's open in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the beautiful sunshine today. And we thank you again for another opportunity to come together and just to be around your word and around each other and just to be an encouragement. And we just pray again that you would open our hearts, our minds, our understanding, that we might see you and love you and serve you better. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Before I forget, on your assignment sheet for this coming week, I forgot to put one thing on, so I'm adding something. I want, that formula, these are the generations of, you're going to encounter it twice in chapter 11, so just underline it with a regular old pen or pencil. These are the generations of, it occurs in verse 10 and verse 27. And then we won't say it again until chapter 25. So, right, before I forget, I wanted to get that in for you. Okay, so several of you said you had questions about this. Okay, the green names is Lud, or however you pronounce that, over here on the Mediterranean Sea, and Aram, and Asher, Arpachshad, and Elam.
And that was Shem?
That's Shem's sons. And then the purple ones, I think, are Japheth's sons. And they're over here, all the way over to what is modern-day Italy, Tyrus and Javan over here. And then Meshech and Magog and Tubal and Gomer and Madai. And then Ham's 4 sons are all in either Canaan or down in the Egypt region. Okay, and so now that you see where they are, what is the regional name for the descendants of Shem? According to your little box that you have, or somewhere you have a little box. Or on your thing I gave you some choices. Okay, Shems are the Middle Eastern Persian / Persian peoples are all descended from Shem. And Ham, as you can see, is Canaanite / African.
The only one I got.
And then Japheth is Indo-European. So, and then you can just paste that in your books somewhere there on chapter 10 where it'll be handy for you. Okay, so with that, we'll start in on the Stranger book. We have chapter 8 for this week. I think of this chapter as the bad news chapter. Everybody's pronounced guilty at the end of this chapter. But you've got to understand the bad news before you can really accept and appreciate the good news, the gospel. So he's doing his best to say, look, that gavel's coming down, guilty as charged, you're under sentence. But anyway, in the first section of chapter 8, we see the miraculous provision of God for his people. All kinds of provisions. As I said, you had this throng of millions of people, really. Well, how do you get them all to move forward together in the same direction without losing some, or some of the sheep or the cattle? So God had, what did God do? You tell me.
Well, then he sent them in the desert. He gave them water, gave them food.
Right, but how did he lead them?
Cloud.
The cloud.
Yeah.
At daytime, it was a pillar of cloud, so wherever they were, they could look up, and see where this pillar was and keep following that direction. At night, it was fire. So day or night, they could travel if they had to and go in the right direction. And then you're right, you also need to provide food, lots of food for that many people, and water. Not just for the people, but also for all those animals that they had with them. I mean, that's a lot. And I appreciate the fact that when he had Moses strike the rock, it says, don't just think of a little faucet. No, this is a gushing river that came flowing out of that thing. So, and what was his purpose in doing that? As always, God has something more in mind than just food. Food's important. We've got to have it or we die. But he always has something else in mind. One thing, he wanted them to learn to trust him. You're out in the middle of the desert, you don't see a way, trust me. I make a way. I make a way for you to travel, I make a way for you to be fed and to have water. So you're not going to die. So he wanted them to learn. He's giving them opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to trust him today for their daily bread. He's going to keep bringing this stuff. It's not if we don't eat it today, we're done.
Right.
But then he also was examining their hearts to see if they would obey him, because there were some rules about this manna. You only gathered enough for the day. You don't hoard it. And then when the people that tried to hoard it found out, not a good idea.
Yeah. Moldy.
Yeah, just rotting and got worms. And I mean, it's like, ooh, yeah. Except on the 6th day, because he's wanting to teach them to rest on the Sabbath. It says on day 6, gather 2 days worth, and this time it won't rot. So again, they had to keep trusting him that he was, and he was testing them. Okay, and then the second section deals with the giving of the 10 rules or the 10 commandments as we know them by. And I think, we are so familiar with these. We've heard them probably since we were kids. Mm-hmm. I think we fail sometimes to appreciate just how all-encompassing they were. Very simple statements, and yet if you think about it, those 10 rules cover every single relationship in our lives. They cover our relationship with God. They cover our relationship with our parents and with our children and with the rest of our family, with our husbands and wives, with our neighbors. Don't steal from them, don't kill them, with strangers that we meet. And I just thought, think what our world would be like if everyone everywhere followed those 10 simple rules. But, of course, we don't. We fail. We don't follow them perfectly every second of our lives. And so the last section of this chapter deals with what the author calls the courtroom in which we are pronounced guilty as charged. And like I said before, this is the bad news that we have to understand before the gospel, the good news, will make sense to us. We desperately want to do something to earn our way. And God says it doesn't work that way. There's nothing you can do that's enough, So unless, we're not just sinners, we're helpless. And unless God makes a way, there is no way. And I wanted to share, I think I told you at the beginning of this class that there's actually 2 or 3 versions of this book. Mm-hmm. The version we're using is for people that are at least somewhat familiar with the Bible and, have had some training and knowledge. This is for pagan peoples, modern pagan peoples that don't believe in God. Maybe they're coming to believe in God, but they know nothing about the Bible. And so he elaborates a little bit more. It follows the same basic structure. And I liked what he put in on the 10 Commandments. You notice the little sketch there looks like Egyptian drawings, because he kind of makes a parallel with a neutral pagan, ancient society, instead of just in your face, you pagan you, But I want to just read this. It says, a sinner will admit he's not perfect, but he believes there's something he can do to make himself good enough for the afterlife. He may think that going to a temple or praying to an idol or offering food and money, meditating, giving to charity, or being nice to neighbors will build more good merit than bad. He may think that observing the 10 Commandments or keeping the Golden Rule or saying the Rosary or being baptized will result in his good outweighing his bad. The weigh scale notion is an ancient concept. The Egyptians believed that when a person died, the heart of the deceased person was taken by the gods and placed on one side of a weigh scale. On the other side was put something called the feather of truth. If the deceased was found to be righteous, then he could enter the fields of peace. If he was unworthy, his heart was eaten by a strange beast. It needs to be understood that this wasn't an actual weighing of the heart done by the Egyptians, but a ceremony that they believed was performed by the gods in the afterlife. But it's still this idea of putting your heart on a scale and seeing if it is right. Variations of this weigh scale idea abound. Perhaps the most common notion is, when I die, if I have enough good karma, if I've done more good things than bad, if my good outweighs my bad, then whatever happens after death, I'll be fine. But there's a major flaw with the weigh scale concept. It doesn't stand up to analysis, and you realize there is not a courtroom in the world that uses a weigh scale to determine if somebody's guilty or not. No earthly court of law would forgive a thief because the crook says, "Judge, you're right. I should not have stolen this one item, but just think of all the good things I didn't steal. My good outweighs my bad." And when you think about it, the weigh scale idea is ridiculous. And if such an idea offends our sense of fairness, then we can't expect a God of perfect justice to use it either. So I just thought I'd like that to give a little bit more background, that this isn't a new concept, been around for millennia.
I like the analogy of the mirror.
Yes, yeah.
And it's like trying to use a mirror to wipe dirt off your face.
And all you'll do is cut yourself.
Or smear it all up and...
Yeah. So, okay. So with that, that brings us then to our Bible study. And we're going to start off with an introduction. You think, well, here we are, 8 sessions in, and we're getting the introduction to Genesis. Giving the introductory information about a book is normally something you do at the very beginning, but because we're also doing The Stranger, and we're also doing some evolution things, I chose to omit that material at first in order to keep the lectures sort of reasonable and length. But we have reached a point in the narrative where it's going to be helpful to consider who wrote the book and who he was writing it to. So to start off our study of Genesis Day, we're going to look at a little fill in the blank, and that's that little cream-colored half sheet that you have there. And when you get done filling, we'll just go ahead and fill it out in class. When you get done filling it out, you can put it right after the preface at the beginning of your journal, so that you'll have the introductory material. Okay, so who wrote the book of Genesis? You probably already know, but if you don't, it's Moses. And who was Moses? Well, he was a lot of things. He was their leader, for one thing, of the Israelites. He was the giver of the law. He's the one that God wrote the tablets of stone and then put them in his hand to bring down to the people. He was a judge, meaning they would bring all their petty grievances to him and he would decide, who had to pay what or do what. He was a shepherd at one point in his life. And he was a writer. He wrote the first 5 books of our Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, among other things. He was also, you may know his story, he was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh herself and raised as a prince. And then he got in trouble and they wanted to kill him, so he ran off. And then he was a shepherd, so I thought, well, that's quite the come down. But God was teaching him how to shepherd sheep so that he could later shepherd people. Anyway, when was it written? About 3,500 years ago. Yeah. So it's been around for a spell. To whom was it written? Well, Moses was writing it initially for the generation of Israelites getting ready to enter the Promised Land. They'd just been delivered from Egypt. They'd been slaves there, or their people had been slaves there for over 400 years. God has delivered them under Moses' leadership. And so he's writing all these things for the benefit of that generation of people. He gave them what Jim Wilkin calls roots and shoots. He wants to tell them who they are. That's their roots, where they came from. But he also wants to tell them who they should be. When you plant seeds, you want them to grow a certain way. You want them to flourish and thrive and produce fruit. So he's giving them information to help them with both those things. He was telling the original audience, those Israelites, how it happened that they came to be in Egypt. And he also lets them know where they're headed now, which is Canaan, the land of Canaan. So all these things were written to those Israelites, but it was also written for us. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 6, which says that all these things that were recorded in the Old Testament were written down for our example, so that we could learn from it. So, and as Jen Wilkin points out, it was written for a whole collection of people, to a whole group of Israelites initially, and now to the whole family of God all over the world. So we do want to know how this part of the Bible applies to us. But first of all, let's think about how it applies to the church as a whole, or the family of God as a whole. But anyway, so that's to whom it was written, to them and to us. In what style was it written? Well, Genesis was written as historical narrative, meaning it was meant to be taken as fact. It was not meant to say this is a bunch of allegories. No, these are real people who lived in history with real things happening to them. But the stories in Genesis are what we call archetypal, which means that they're patterns or they're examples. And you tend to see the same kinds of things happening over and over again. You kind of begin to recognize some of those patterns as you go through it. Okay? And then another comment that Jen made on this historical narrative, we in our culture we think of history as an objective retelling. And if it's not objective, we think somebody's trying to pull something over on us. He's rewriting history here. But biblical authors wrote with the goal of convincing someone of a particular idea. Not to trick them, not to fool them. But in other words, Moses intended to convince us that God created the world. It didn't just happen. And he wants us to be very firm in that belief by the time he's done. He wants us to understand where sin came from and why it's so offensive and so on. So he's always trying to show us some truth and convince us of the truth of that truth. Okay. And then what's the central theme of the book? Well, the very word Genesis means beginning, and that's exactly what we find. The beginning of the world, of history, of sin, of redemption, of God's chosen people, and all the different languages, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, and I have tape and glue stick there if you want to stick that in now, or you can do it at home, whichever.
You want it after the...
Yeah, I thought after the preface, that way it's at the beginning, but you can still read everything easily there at that beginning. Okay, so that brings us to Genesis, the last part of Genesis chapter 9. We're going to read verses 18 and 19 right now. Oops. And we're on page 40. It says, the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah. And from these, the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Okay, so we pick up the narrative today with statements about Noah's three sons. The three sentences that are given in these two verses sound pretty straightforward, but there's some interesting facts hidden in them. First of all, Noah's three sons are always listed as Shem, Ham, and Japheth, in that order. And normally you would expect that to be their birth order, because that's usually the way names were given. But we quickly learn that while Shem is the oldest, and we see that from Genesis 10:21, where it talks about him being the older brother of Japheth, Ham is actually the youngest, according to verse 24. The probable reason for listing their names in the order that Moses uses is that Shem and Ham are going to play very important roles in the narrative. And so probably they're being emphasized. It's not that Japheth isn't important, but Shem and Ham are going to be very important in different ways. Okay, The second thing we see is this little parenthetical thought, Ham was the father of Canaan, almost sounds like an aside. But Moses doesn't do asides. He always has a reason for listing a name. And the name of Canaan would have really made the ears of the original audience perk up. Because Canaan's descendants, the Canaanites, were strong enemies of the Jews at the time that Moses was writing Genesis. The two nations would soon be facing off in battle when it came time for Joshua to lead them into the promised land. They were going to have to drive them out, and they didn't want to leave. So they were going to be fighting these people. The land where the Canaanites were strongly entrenched. And so Moses is about to explain how that came to be. How is it that they got there first, you know? Okay, the third fact we're given is that from these three sons, the people of the whole earth were dispersed. And Moses is going to give the particulars of that dispersion shortly. But first he has to give a little background so that we'll better understand what happened. And that brings us then to the next section, verses 20 to 23. It says this: Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside, "You should see the old man." You know. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they didn't see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Okay, so the first thing we learn, sadly, is a very sad episode in Noah's family. He's become a farmer who grew grapes and then made wine from the grapes. And various commentators have various opinions about him getting drunk. And quite frankly, a lot of the commentators have a kind of attitude, shame on Noah, you know. But when I think of Noah's lifestyle of complete obedience up to this point, and it's a lifestyle that earned him a place in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11, where it talks about, by faith this person did this, by faith this person did this, by faith Noah. I just think, you know, he's gotten off the boat, he's planted a vineyard. How long does it take for a vineyard to produce grapes? A while. And then you pick the grapes, and how long does it take them to ferment to make good wine? A while. I just think he's thrilled. He's had a bumper crop, and I think he's celebrating, and he just celebrated a little bit too much. But you notice it doesn't say he became a drunkard. He didn't change his lifestyle. He just became drunk one time. And it doesn't say he was running around naked outside. He knew enough when he was starting to get woozy to go inside. And I'm thinking, what was Ham doing in his tent anyway? What was he up to? You know? So anyway, that's my personal take on Noah. He just one time had a little bit too much.
I don't understand why he got mad though that they covered him.
Oh, he wasn't mad at the two. He was mad at the son that went out and blabbed this all over.
Oh.
That's what it, and we'll come to that. Okay. So I kind of think that maybe he was unwise, but that was probably the extent of it, and he got himself into an embarrassing situation.
Right.
But there is absolutely no question that Ham's behavior was very bad, disrespectful in the extreme. Moses' original audience, those Israelites who had just gotten the Ten Commandments, they would have recognized immediately that Ham was violating the fifth one, honor your father and mother. And even though Ham wouldn't have had the specific wording of that commandment, it's evident from the reaction of his two brothers and of his father that everybody knew that his behavior was disrespectful and offensive. As the authors of the Bible Knowledge Commentary point out, to the ancients, even seeing one's father naked was a breach of family ethic. The sanctity of the family was destroyed, and the strength of the father was made a mockery. Ham apparently stumbled upon this accidentally. Again, my question is, what was he doing in his father's tent? And he could have covered his father, but he didn't. He went out and made sure everybody knew about it, you know. So he went out, he exultingly told his two brothers as if he had triumphed over his father. So what seems to be a trivial incident turns out to be a major event. Noah's oracle or prophecy in verses 25 to 27 showed that the natures of his three sons would be perpetuated in their descendants, which will become evident as the narrative continues. Remember, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so now we come to verses 24 through 27, where Noah is reacting to what's happened to him, and he says, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." Okay? So, Noah wakes up out of his stupor. He learns what Ham has done to him, and he says, "Cursed be Canaan." Wait a minute. Why is Canaan being cursed when it was Ham that did the wrong, right? First glance, that doesn't seem right. But further reflection indicates that this truly is a fitting retribution for Ham. Ham is the youngest of Noah's sons, and he's just publicly dishonored his father. So guess what? Ham is going to suffer shame when his own youngest son, Canaan, brings dishonor to the family down the line. The commentary people say this: Ham had made an irreparable breach in his father's family, so a curse would be put on his son's family. And we have seen something like this before. Remember what happened after Cain murdered his brother and was sent away? Then you have his genealogy, and 7 generations down you have this guy Lamech, who also committed murder, but he didn't even try to cover his murder up. He was bragging about it. And we're going to see the same type of thing happen. Ham had this character flaw, and it's going to be extended and carried to the extreme in Canaan, and then in Canaan's descendants. So we're going to see that Ham's descendants through Canaan are going to become progressively more and more evil until they finally come under God's judgment in Moses and Joshua's day. Okay, so now let's look at what is involved in this curse. Noah says 3 times that Canaan, and by implication his descendants, will be a servant to the descendants of Shem and Japheth. And the commentary elaborates on this. The enslavement of Canaanites is seen in many situations in the history of the Old Testament. Such a case turned up fairly soon. The Canaanites were defeated and enslaved by eastern kings in Genesis 14. Another example was the Gibeonites. That was one particular clan among the Canaanites, who later, under Joshua, became wood choppers and wood carriers for Israel's tabernacle. So that's going to be part of their fate. But Noah's prophecy concerning the future relationship of the descendants of his 3 sons did not involve just a curse. There was also the promise of blessing to come through Shem, and the indication that there would generally be friendly relations between the Japhethites and the Shemites. When it says that Japheth would dwell in the tents of Shem, that has to do with this Eastern hospitality. When somebody took you into their tent, they fed you elaborately, they took care of you. It means, it's not that Japheth is going to take over Shem's territory. It's more that they're on friendly relations and Shem's going to invite him right in. But anyway. Okay, so that brings us down to the last 2 verses. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So, chapter 9 ends with the death of Noah, effectively ending the genealogy that began way back in chapter 5. Okay, so now we come to chapter 10. These are the generations of the sons. Did I assign 10? No. Okay. I got myself confused. I think I'll go ahead and read this, and we'll go over it in more detail next week. When we come to the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, chapter 10 tells us where they ended up, and that's what you did on that map exercise, where you circled their names and the names of the sons. So Moses uses that familiar pattern to let us know he's now going to tell us more about what happened to them and their descendants. Japheth is named last, as usual, but Moses then reverses the order and begins this section of the narrative by telling his readers where Japheth's descendants settled. And as you saw when you did that exercise, the Japhethites became the ancestors of the Indo-European peoples. So in all likelihood,
You did have us read 10.
beg pardon?
You did have us read 10.
Okay, good. I was working ahead this week, and sometimes I get confused about whoops. So actually, we may be Japhethites, ladies. You know, those are probably some of our ancestors came down through him.
How did you make that decision?
Because my ancestors come from Europe.
That's what okay.
Yeah. So in all likelihood. I mean, I'm sure there were some intermarriages going on and so on. And anyway, I'm pretty sure I'm a Japhethite several times removed. Okay. And then, so that's just this itty bitty little paragraph about the Japhethites, and that takes care of where they went. But then he has this quite lengthy thing on the sons of Ham. And I'm not going to read that because it's largely a list of names, but I'll read sections of it as we come to it. But anyway, Moses devotes several verses to the descendants of Ham, and there's a reason for that. Many of Ham's descendants became bitter enemies of the future Israelites. As we read through the list of all these names, we find the names of several cities that would become centers of wickedness and oppression, such as Babel, which became Babylon. And you remember from our study in Revelation, nothing good came out of Babylon. Nineveh. The Ninevites were fierce, cruel warriors. And they took some of the Israelites captive. And horrible. Sodom and Gomorrah. To this day, you hear those two names and they go, oh boy, gross sin. You know, those, guess what? They all came from descendants of Ham, or that's where they originated. So there's cities. Then there's also, in these verses, there's several people groups that would have been very familiar for a wrong reason to Moses' original audience. There were the Philistines. Remember the story of David and Goliath? Goliath was a Philistine. The Canaanites in general, and then a whole gaggle of ites. You know, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the this ites, you know, and what your mom calls the parasites. But anyway, a whole bunch of ites. And, I mean...
And the ites, most of the ites were negative people.
Yes, most of them were.
Most of them.
And we see them listed here in Genesis. But here's just one set, the Amorites. This is how many listings there are in my concordance for where else they're found. For example, they're named not just in Genesis, but they're referred to in Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. They were one of the clans that they had to drive out of Canaan. Deuteronomy. Then some of the prophets, Ezekiel, Amos, Ezra, Nehemiah, are listed in the Psalms. I mean, you just encounter these enemies over and over. We're going to trip over them a lot. as we go through the Old Testament. Okay, so we have evil cities, we have evil people groups, and not only that, but we also see some of the lands where the descendants of Canaan settled, two of which were Assyria and Egypt. Now, where had Moses' original audience just been held as slaves? Egypt. And where would they go into captivity again, several generations down the line? Assyria. So, this is trouble. And Moses is showing us this is where it all began, folks. Came from here. Okay. Now, in the middle of all this thing about just the clans and the ites and all those things in general, we encounter an individual. Down in verse 9, well, actually 8. Cush, who was, Cush was Ham's oldest son, and Cush fathered Nimrod. So Nimrod was Ham's grandson. And Nimrod was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, and therefore it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And from that land, he went into Assyria and built Nineveh and a whole bunch of other cities. And I guess that's the main cities that he was sort of responsible for. So, the first description of Nimrod sounds sort of positive. It says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. So much so that his hunting ability was actually legendary, and it became a proverb that the people in Moses' day was very familiar with. But further reflection sheds a little different light on this man. The Hebrew root of Nimrod's name does mean mighty, but it can also mean tyrant or warrior. And think back, remember back to chapter 6, before the flood, it talks about the mighty men of old and how violence filled the land. Those men were mighty, but they were also bullies and tyrants who used their strength to terrorize those around them. And when we look at Nimrod's accomplishments, they're indeed impressive. And we founded all these cities, but not in a good way. Verse 10 indicates he was a king who began his kingdom in Babel. And as we're going to see next week, Babel is synonymous with rebellion and idolatry and evil, evil, evil. That's where his kingdom began. And then he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Okay, so he founded that city. So he was instrumental in the rebellion of Babel against God, and he went on to build up more and more strongholds of rebellion. It's interesting that long after Moses is off the scene, the prophet Micah mentions Nimrod in the middle of one of his prophecies concerning Christ. He says this in Micah 5, verses 5 and 6, "When the Assyrian comes into our lands and treads in our palaces, and the land of Nimrod at its entrances, he, the Messiah, shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and treads within our border." So, again, what sounded sort of positive ended up negative because he was doing it all for his own pride, And then last of all, in chapter 10, we're told where Shem's people settled, and that would have been of special interest to Moses' original audience because these are their ancestors. They're all Shemites. And it's of special interest to us today because we know that the promised deliverer, Christ, is a descendant of Shem. So we're going to look right in the middle of these verses. We're down in verse 24. So Shem has a son named Arpachshad, and Arpachshad fathered Shelah, and Shelah fathered Eber. To Eber were born two sons. The name of the one for Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, what on earth does that mean? The earth was divided. Well, we're down, it says, once again, Moses is dropping a hint about a topic he's about to address, and that is, where did all the different languages in the world come from? You may have noticed that Moses ended each of the 3 sections about the dispersion of the descendants of Noah's sons with the same statement. These are the sons of Japheth by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. These are the sons of Shem by their clans, by their languages, It says the same thing. And when we look at chapter 11 next week, we're going to see that at one point, like when they got off the ark, everybody on earth spoke the same language. There was only one language. And everybody used the same words. So how did that change? How did we get to where we are today? Well, we're going to get the detailed answer to that next week. But Moses lets his audience know that that event that changed that happened during Peleg's life, maybe around the time he was born. Because it sounds almost like he was named for that event. It says, what does it say? The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. And that looks like one of those famous Hebrew word plays. The verb for divide is palak. So he's Peleg. Kind of a same kind of a sound. But anyway, and that brings us to the very last verse of chapter 10, which kind of is a summary of the whole thing. These are the clans of all the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. And we think, oh good, because what had God told them to do when they got off the boat? Said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Like, oh good, that's exactly what they did. Or did they? We shall see next week. Okay, and then to wrap up for our evolution study today, I thought it'd be kind of interesting since we're talking about ancient civilizations and people founding cities and that kind of thing. I wanted to address a few things. What were the capabilities of original man? When you see all the school book drawings, you always see some kind of ape man not wearing clothes. And it'll take them a few hundred years to figure out how to start a fire and yada, yada, yada. Well, just how smart was original man? Many of us have heard that a mature human uses less than 10% of his brain in his lifetime. I thought I had a little paper in here. Good. Okay. You no doubt know some who get by on a whole lot less. The brain has the uncanny ability to store the equivalent of millions of bits of information every second, while it automatically regulates many of the delicate chemical functions of the entire body. And we're not even aware of it. It's just happening in our brain. Our processor's working, and we don't even know it. But in terms of memory capacity, each of us has the ability to see, hear, and feel a new snapshot of experience every second for 1 million years and record every detail with precision. No computer can match the human brain. Not a computer on Earth. All of that information is stored. Some of us have a harder time than others trying to retrieve it. And yet, all it takes is
retrieval's broken.
But have you ever noticed, all you have to do is get a whiff of some odor, and all of a sudden, you have all these flood of memories that come back that are tied to that odor. I mean, it's just amazing. Well, if evolution were true, why would we have a huge percentage of brain power, maybe 90% of our brain, that we never even tap into in our entire life? Evolution presumes that traits arise because they're useful. Well, so why are we wasting our brain, But anyway, I just thought you know, Adam was no dummy. He was smart, and he didn't have anything, the problems that we have, to get in the way of his being smart, you know, to hinder his brain. Well, another thing, is technology a modern innovation? That's another topic they raise. And we tend to think, oh man, we have so much technology today, and what did they know back then, you know? Science Yearbook 1980, produced by the World Book Encyclopedia, has an article entitled Farming the Negev Desert in Israel. This arid wilderness in southern Israel is springing to life with lush crops like onions and peaches. Why? As the lead caption pointed out, Israeli scientists have revived long-forgotten farming methods to grow crops by storing the sparse desert rain in the soil. Was this some complex technological invention? All they did was build little dikes around sloped plant basins to collect what rain did fall. Brilliant? Indeed. Expensive? No way. It was an ancient method, but very effective. Now, just think, what if we were to try our modern methods of farming there? How would we go about that? Well, to begin with, we'd probably build huge dams hundreds of miles away, and then we'd have pumping stations and pipelines costing millions of shekels to be built to move that water. And then we'd need hydroelectric generators to be built to run the pumping network. And since dry years are anticipated, we need oil-burning power plants to provide a backup source of energy, assuming they were smart enough to not let all the water out of the dams. The more complex our modern technology becomes, the more dependent we are, you know. And things like natural disasters or wars or economic downturns really affect us, you know, because we've lost some of these ancient ways of doing things. Could the ancients actually have had better ways of doing things? And this is one that's written by the author of this book. He says, consider the impact of capitalizing on natural laws to a greater degree than we do. Are there ways to produce larger long-term benefits with less complex hardware? We tend to think that our 21st century technology is the best way to go. But as we explore the clues to ancient people, we find they had a different and quite possibly a wiser approach. For lack of an established definition on this area of study, we're just going to call it simplified ingenuity. And here's a picture of a 1,000-year-old ruin from the Mayas down in South America. The author went there to visit that. He says it's in the tropical Mexican city of Palenque. When I was there on a sweltering April day, the temperature was about 100 degrees and the humidity was 100%. but inside this immense 6-story high structure, the rooms were air conditioned. Carefully engineered corridors channeled cool air through massive stone passageways, assuring ideal temperatures year-round. Not a machine.
No.
Just bringing the air through these stone passageways. Simplified ingenuity. How would we air condition a building in the tropics? Would our methods be technical, costly, short-lived? This ancient system has been working perfectly for 1,000 years, even with nobody there to maintain it. And you think about, you know, I've read about, we don't know how the Egyptians did their mummies. We can't duplicate it, you know. So anyway. And then just how early in man's history did he build cities? Well, I've already read about Nimrod building a whole bunch of them. But even before that, remember Cain? When Cain had a son, he built a city and named it after his son. And so Cain built a city, and notice it doesn't say he built a mud hut. He built a city. The first son of the first man built the first city on earth, the city of Enoch. Imagine that. And you'd expect a city to have houses and shops and streets and lanes and some kind of government. So knowing people, politics must have gotten an early start in our history. Some people might have a problem with the idea of cities existing even before the flood, but think about it. The very earliest relics of human history soon after the flood indicate the existence of cities. You'd expect that because settlers in a new world tend to rebuild something that reminds them of home, right, where they came from. So what have the archaeologists dug up? If you do a search through some of the magazine articles in the last few decades about ancient cities, like Reader's Digest has 4, Palenque, Mexico's mysterious lost city, and in the beginning, the mystery of ancient Egypt, and then another one, mysteries of the Maya, and then unsolved mysteries of the Great Pyramid. In other words, we can't figure out how they did it. And this is all over the world, from South America to Egypt to, you name it. So this is kind of interesting. We think of these primitive people and what they were. Yeah. So anyway, it's just kind of interesting. So, all right. So next week, we're going to jump in and find out where all these languages came from.
Okay.
Very good.